Right, so Israel's economy is tanking, and tanking fast. In fact, tanks are a good item to bring up because they're running out of them. Their war in Gaza continues to rage on as Benjamin Netanyahu cannot countenance ending things lest it dump him out of power. But what exactly he's going to continue to preside over is another question entirely, because without an economy, Israel has no future. It actually casts a whole new slant on the ongoing genocide, which now sees the likes of Israeli newspapers and the BDS Movement on the same page as each other, as more and more politicians around the world shift their opinions and stances on the ongoing destruction going on in the Middle East, as Netanyahu expands his atrocities, his warfare, and doesn't wind it down. So much of the support Israel has had, to many ordinary people's eternal shame, has been as a result of keeping that ally, that footprint, that platform in the Middle East for Western powers. But if they go bust, as Netanyahu seems determined to spend whatever is necessary to ensure his ridiculous total victory over Hamas, which he's been told repeatedly cannot be achieved, what the likes of the US, the UK and the EU have continued to enable isn't assisting Israel to win, but has actually just carried onwards to now be verging on the edge of being a failed state. Right, so Israel's economy. Without it being strong, it cannot continue to functionally operate as a state. The same is true of all states, of course. And certainly cannot carry on its genocide in Gaza. That much clearly would be obvious. But the situation there is a story that's gone grossly underreported in light of all the violence, death and destruction of Gaza. And actually this is something that has to be addressed, because it's demonstrated that not only is Netanyahu determined to destroy Gaza, his actions show he is hell-bent on destroying Israel if that is what it takes for him to win there. It would be an abject symbol right up there with the clapping of Netanyahu as we saw in Congress in the US this week, sickening scenes that will go down in history, already being compared to similar scenes from 1930s Germany, if Israel as a nation collapsed under the weight of its own crushing debt and economic mismanagement by a man who was completely consumed by the idea of the destruction of another race, namely the Palestinians. When commentators talk about Israel's economy and the impacts on it, often as a result of the news coverage, it often gets looked at in terms of things like the Houthis attacking shipping, half the staff in the southern port of Eilat, for instance, having been laid off because of this interference in support of the people of Gaza, which has of course now prompted several military responses against the Houthis, including by Israel itself after a successful Houthi drone strike in Tel Aviv. But that isn't even the full story. Israel's economy is incredibly reliant on sea trade. It does not have good relations with its neighbouring countries that it might more readily trade with, which is possibly one of the biggest understatements I've ever given. But given we've seen how they are engaged in warfare to the north with Lebanon and Iraq, to the east with Syria, and to Iran further on, and Yemen to the south, it relies on import and export further afield to get by. Now I know people who want to avoid buying Israeli produce, for example, are having to dodge clever labelling tricks or abject refusal by various retail outlets to stop stocking such items. This is what Israel relies on. But all that shipping interference is having an effect, and so is BDS, boycott, divestment and sanctions. But by a long shot, these are not the most damaging issues Israel is facing financially. So as good as Netanyahu is at spending Israel's money on arms, where is it losing all of this money exactly? Why is their economy tanking to the extreme precipice it appears to be verging on? Well, let's start with what is doing well economically in Israel. Arms sales, for example, unsurprisingly, they're rather high in Israel right now. Israel does have numerous arms companies. They are doing well. Unfortunately for Israel's economy, though, most of the sales are domestic. And that doesn't include all manner of other military necessities from abroad, from ammunition to the aforementioned tanks to parts for F-35 jets as manufactured here in the UK. The tech sector in Israel is also doing well, though this is mainly as a result of Israeli tech heads putting their wares up for sale, their companies up for sale, in the hope that a foreign corporation might pick their businesses up and give them a way out of Israel. One notable example recently was Google, who showed interest not too long ago in purchasing the cybersecurity company Wiz, which was founded by former IDF cybersecurity officers, the sale of which would have enabled them to leave Israel. That's not exactly a shining recommendation for anybody wishing to do business in Israel, is it? But that's the extent of where Israel's economy has been doing okay. Weapons and a tech company fire sale. Everything else is up a certain creek without a paddle. Well, on the subject of doing business in Israel, who exactly would want to invest there right now with all the unrest and warfare going on? Warfare, it has to be said, that is mainly leaving the Israeli mainland untouched, making the whole economic picture somehow even worse. But actually there's an aspect to that that makes matters even worse than that, even worse than you might already be thinking. If I told you that foreign investment in Israel was down 60%, would that surprise you? Probably not, given the last 10 months as we've been observing. But if I told you that stat came out a full month before the events of October 7th, would that surprise you? Well, quite possibly. Investment collapse is a story that predates the invasion of Gaza by Israel and all the death and destruction that has been wreaked there, where investments dropped by a third on the previous year, 2022, and sales of startup businesses in Israel to foreign investors, which seems to be a big thing for their economy, also plummeted. Matters will only have got worse since because of the war. Another aspect of this is the investment of ordinary Israelis, and the fact so many of them have been moving their financial assets out of Israel. Pensions, insurance funds, savings are all being shifted all the time because people living in Israel don't want their finances tied to the fate of their own nation. So much of this has gone on that it actually had a weird effect on the economy in Israel in that it actually stabilised it for a while. All of a sudden, funds that ended up being invested in foreign stocks and bonds, as the likes of pensions and other investments were, ended up generating a profit for Israel in foreign currency. But that bubble burst very quickly, and that was down to the biggest boycott, divestment and sanctions action we've still seen yet to date, when Intel pulled the plug on a $25 billion investment plan in Israel just last month. We're still only scratching the surface of it. Tourism is another huge business for Israel. This is the Holy Land for 3 world religions, after all. It's a huge thing for Israel and for the occupied Palestinian territories as it happens as well, with Israel bringing in some $8.46 billion a year and Palestine around $1 billion a year in tourism revenue. But even if people still wanted to go, many tourism companies and airlines won't take you over the safety concerns, and therefore the tourism industry is ground to a halt there, a direct consequence of Netanyahu's ongoing actions in Gaza and everything that's come about from that as a consequence. Following Israel's stupid decision to take potshots at Iran's embassy in Syria a few months ago, we haven't forgotten that, have we? Nothing quite like the prospect of war with a far greater nation than Israel is used to taking on to make credit agencies nervous. And Israel has had its long-term credit rating reduced following that by not 1 but 2 US credit agencies. And just last week, news came out that official figures for the number of businesses that have gone under in Israel, gone bust since October 7th, so all, again, a direct consequence of the war in Gaza that they've kept going, have apparently hit 46,000 businesses. That's how many of them have gone bust, and are expected to rise to 60,000 businesses by the end of this year. Here's an excerpt from the New Arab on that. Around 46,000 businesses have been forced to close in Israel since the start of the war on Gaza on the 7th of October, Hebrew newspaper Mariv reported this week, adding that Israel is now in collapse. The report states the ongoing war on the besieged enclave has hit the economy heavily, with many of the companies affected being small businesses. The CEO of an Israeli credit risk management firm under the name Coface BDI told the Hebrew paper that other sectors have also been impacted. About 77% of the businesses that have been closed since the beginning of the war, which make up about 35,000 businesses, are small businesses with up to 5 employees and are the most vulnerable in the economy, Yoel Amir said. The most vulnerable industries are the construction industry, and as a result the entire ecosystem that operates around it, ceramics, air conditioning, aluminium, building materials and more, he added, based on their risk ratings. So this is an issue with a series of ongoing knock-on effects still to come, still to be felt, as we're talking about industries which make up a lot of Israeli infrastructure, not just economic benefit for the country. But I'll add another point to that, though, by bringing up Israel's power grid. Israel's reliant on coal-fired power stations to meet their electricity and energy needs, despite having moved over to natural gas more, which is more readily available in their part of the world. Their coal demands, though, the coal they receive comes from Colombia, who have announced that there will be no more coal shipments at all until the atrocities in Gaza are over. So for a nation so heavily invested in tech companies, they won't get very far with a basic like electricity running out, and they are still very much reliant on coal to deliver that. Israel will go from an image of being a developed country to being back in the Stone Age, so to speak, very shortly without a shift. It's no longer just about this war of attrition with Gaza for the people of Israel anymore. The nation's survival likely depends on ditching Netanyahu, and countries so invested in Israel and its future, like the US, like the UK, they need to decide whether they support Israel or Netanyahu, because the two don't seem to be mutually compatible any longer. So far, those countries haven't shown a choice necessarily between those two, what I consider basic truths at this point, proven beyond doubt when they assisted Israel in a strike on civilian territory in Yemen recently, full details of which you can get on this video recommendation here. This is your next watch, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.